All right, so we're back on this Ned Block talk. We're back on this Ned Block talk. I made it about, I don't know, a few minutes in last time. We're just starting to set up what I take to be the main project of his, which is trying to distinguish, at the moment anyway, trying to distinguish um, seeing from thinking, or perception from cognition, to put it more technically. Right now, I think he's just trying to tell us what he means by these terms. So we were just left off last video. If you weren't around, he was telling us. I guess I should have looked at this before. He was telling us how he understands what a concept is, and the difference between that and perception. So he was talking about like, for example, inattentional blindness and so forth. On his view, there's two ways to look at what's going on there. On the one hand, you have the conscious experience, but you just can't conceptualize it. That's his view. On the other hand, you don't have the conscious experience until you conceptualize it. That's the other view. So here he's trying to illustrate. In a way here. Oops. Oh, I see what's going on. Okay. He's trying to illustrate. Oh, cool. I'm going down. How small should I be? I don't even really care. Anyway, so he's just giving another example of that distinction. So let's listen in.
Babies in many experimental situations do not seem to adequately conceptualize colors. So you can have a blue thing coming out one side and a red thing coming out the other side. And yet when the screen goes down, the baby does not expect two things, even as late as 12 months old. This suggests that color experience can be non-conceptual.
So when he says that they don't expect two things, this kind of work is based on looking time studies. So this is the idea that when something is novel or interesting, babies look at it longer. And when something is kind of expected, they're less interested in it. So if they expected that there would be two things, so if they saw the blue car come out one side and the red car come out the other side, the hypothesis here is that if they expected two things to be behind the barrier when it was lifted, then they would be uninterested. But when you lift the barrier, they apparently are very interested. This is from Shu and Carey from the 1990s, this work. And so the babies have more looking time in this case than when the colors are the same or whatever. And so this indicates that they didn't expect there to be two things. They thought there should be one thing, which Block is using to indicate, in his view, that they're not tracking the difference in the color. They just are tracking the object, but not the difference in the color.
So what's this percept-concept distinction? It's that it's a matter of two things. One is conceptual role. Roughly, perception is informationally encapsulated, and cognition is inferentially promiscuous, to use Steve Stitch's term for freely usable in reasoning. One index is logical operations, which...
What's that? Either that thing is F or it is G. That thing is not F, so that thing is G. All right, so this is the computational stuff, the logical operations. That's disjunctive syllogism right there, etc. Okay, so these are conceptual, not perceptual, on Block's view.
Generally thought to be conceptual, not perceptual. Another a way of distinguishing is format. Percepts are iconic, concepts are these predicative representations that I mentioned. So there's a joint in nature between...
So the predicative representations, he's working off of a specific view from Tyler Bird's, but the basic idea is just that what the sensory systems or perceptual system are doing is something that, someone like Austin Clark would call feature placing, or they're representing, predicating of things in the environment. They have certain properties, right? So but not in a conceptual way.
Perception and thought. So
that last time he said that, you would kind of capture what these things were as saying, that's F or something like that. But, that's red, but not in a conceptual way.
But by thought, I just mean cognition. Here is Tyler Burge's way of thinking about it.
Oh, I thought he had already done this, so he's gonna do it now. He talks about this a lot, and Block has gone around saying that he thinks this Burge stuff is like very important. So in a lot of his talks, he uses this as a way to talk about what the perceptual systems are doing and how the distinction between cognition and perception can be drawn very clearly on his view.
So you have an attribute in the world like this redness. You have a perceptual representation that is iconic but can be put in words as that F, where F is an attributive. He calls it an attributive, but it's a perceptual representation of redness. The next stage is a basic perceptual judgment and then a non-basic perceptual judgment. And the idea is that the border between perception and cognition is here. Of course.
So now notice what Block is attributing to Burge is the view that perception is wholly iconic, whereas cognition is conceptualized. And so, I like the view personally that says that perception is kind of mixed. That actually what you should think of as the perception is this kind of thing over here together with that is red, basic perceptual judgment. I'm not really sure you should count as perceiving red if you don't have a judgment about the thing being red, but that's a different, so I would count this as the perception. But Block wants to count this as a perception, only the stuff on the other side. And he wants to say that it represents roughly the kind of thing I was thinking about, that it's red out there, there's redness there, but in a iconic, non-conceptual way. And so while I think, yeah, possibly there are these kinds of representations, I think it's a whole nother story about whether they count as perception, and a whole nother story about whether they're conscious, always, which is something that Block is going to assume.
This allows for top-down feedback, but the idea is that the top-down feedback is consistent with a difference of kind. Now, the problem for thinking about consciousness is that the only way to find out about this, that is...
So now notice what he's doing right here is he's assuming, so he says the only way to find out about this, the perception bit, is to ask for judgments about whether the thing out there is red or not. Thereby assuming that this stuff, whatever it is conscious in a way that's independent of those sort of things over here, which is, I'm just saying, I think the perceptual state itself already has some concepts involved. And then whether the perception is conscious by itself or something needs to render it conscious is something that's sort of just elicited here. Now, I know we're not even 19 minutes into a 5.5 hour set of talks. But anyway, so I'll shut up then and let's continue.
Perception is to elicit basic perceptual judgments or non-basic perceptual judgments. And that is the methodological issue. Just to be clear about what the difference...
So notice that non-conceptual representations could occur unconsciously, possibly. So he's a sort of assuming that these non-conceptual perceptual representations, when they occur, are conscious. It doesn't seem to me we should make that assumption. Maybe it's true, I don't know, but he's assuming it without argument.
The difference is non-conceptual representations are ones we might share with a creature that perceives but does not even have concepts. Conceptual representations are involved in seeing as, by the way, the topic of tomorrow's lecture, where there is no purely perceptual representation.
So the seeing as bit is like, when my dog and I look at the iPhone, I see it as an iPhone, whereas my dog, if anything, sees it as a object shape of some sort, or something that's with a smell and blah, 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 but it doesn't see it as an iPhone because that requires having the concept. That's what's going to be the talk for tomorrow, apparently.
Seeing something as a TV or a cactus.
Oh, okay.
So in these terms then, the inattentional blindness view is that we don't see the leaves that appear and disappear, but the inattentional accessibility view is we don't form a concept of.
So I think the leaves are here. Is this, I forget, we go back and watch the other one, but the leaves are not here. They are here. They blink back and forth. People look around. They don't see it. Here, there's a difference between the beginning and the end of the color of the platform. People don't notice it. It's very shocking. And so he's arguing here. Well, this is what I already said. I thought he had already done this. I must have just been confusing what I antecedently know from what I've,
From
or maybe
what
I
I'm
should
noticing.
rewatch that video.
Similarly,
Did he talk
here
about
the
this?
inattentional blindness is we don't see the color. The inattentional inaccessibility view is that we don't form the concept. So here are my
Wait, hold on. So
similarly,
that's what I was just saying, right? So on one view, we don't consciously experience the transition because we don't form the concept of it changing, apply it. And on the other view, we have the experience of the change, but we don't have the concept of the difference, and so we don't notice it, but that we still experienced it. So those are the two views.
here the inattentional blindness is we don't see the color. The inattentional inaccessibility view is that we don't form the concept. So here are my hypotheses. Consciously conceptualizing the stimulus requires global broadcasting.
Yeah, so notice consciously conceptualizing the stimulus. Yeah, I'm not sure if I buy this. So first of all, what do you mean by consciously conceptualizing? Can't there be unconscious conceptualizing? Isn't there conceptualizing outside of global workspace? We'll see where this goes.
And second,
I'm thinking of Mary Potter's work, that one where they do fast serial presentations and people are able to like say stuff about it, but it's really quick. It seems weird to say that they anyway, we'll get to that stuff, I guess.
non-conceptual conscious percepts do not require global broadcasting.
All right, so this is his basis of the argument against global workspace theory. So what's it say? One, consciously conceptualizing the stimulus requires global workspace. So, but to have the conscious percept doesn't. I mean, I kind of almost agree maybe that you don't need to have global workspace involved in conscious percepts, but non-conscious conscious percepts, I don't even know what that means. So let's see how he's going to substantiate these things.
Non-conceptual conscious percepts do not require global broadcasting. So in those terms, my critique of the global workspace view is that they've been studying conceptualized consciousness rather than pure unconceptualized consciousness.
Now, all right, hold on. So I'm not a big fan of the global workspace theory. I don't think it obviously has much to do with consciousness. It has to do with controlling behavior and making information widely available and shared and blah 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 for reasoning and behavior. Okay, great. That's what it seems like. It's for intelligence. But the conceptualized consciousness rather than pure unconceptualized consciousness. Okay, so obviously that depends on there being pure unconceptualized consciousness. So let's see how this shakes out. That's interesting.
Now, let me get to the experimental paradigms, and I'll mention three, but there are a few others. But these, well, the first two of these just came out this year. So this is an experiment by Marius Usher's group.
Yeah, okay, so he's been talking about this for a while.
I'm pleased to say that one of the authors is a philosopher, Hiller Jacobson. So what they did was this. They contrasted they used a modified Sperling where the Q comes first. And they contrasted.
So if you don't know what that means, right? So what they're showing you here is, can we zoom in on this? So we have these Sperling type things here. They're letters arranged in this block, and you flash them briefly and ask people to name as many as they can. And what Sperling did was to cue a certain row that you're supposed to report, but famously the cue, like it would point here after the stimulus disappeared. Okay, so you could cue before or after, but the surprising stuff is that when you cue it after, people are still pretty good at reporting, even though stimulus is no longer there.
High and low color diversity. So these
hold on.
Just a modified Sperling where the Q comes first. And they contrasted high and low color diversity.
Okay. So in fact, you can see this down here in the next slide. So the Q is here. So that's how they're cueing which row to pay attention to. Oh, and the Sperling, it came first. I mean, it came after, but this time they're doing it the other way. But just checking, is it? I think it was the case that I came after, right? But anyway, so they cue you, then they show you, okay, and then they say color diversity, high or low. So was there a lot of different colors? You can see some of these are relatively the same, and some of these are very diverse. So that's what they are. So yeah, this says it came out in 2014. So if he said this came out just this year, this must be given that he gave the talk in around that time. So it's pretty old. Okay, cool.
So
The book is about to come out.
Arrays are arrays with different combinations of high diversity and low diversity in the queued and unqueued rows. So this is low diversity of the non-queued rows and low diversity of the queued rows. This is high diversity of the queued row and low diversity of the unqueued rows. And here's the way the experiment worked. Is first there was the queue, then there was this array of letters, then there was a blank interval, and then there was a box along somewhere in that a queued row, and the subjects had to say what letter was in that, where that box was. So this looks like the second letter, so I guess it's an R there. It looks like this, to me it looks like the second. It's not very clear which one this is, but anyway. And then they give it a diversity, a binary diversity judgment, high or low, and that could either be in some blocks the queued row and some blocks the unqueued row. The diversities were, the high diversity was all of the 19 colors they used. The low diversity was about a third of them, and that's what I just said. Naming the letters was described as the main task, and they were given feedback on that main task.
So now notice what they're trying to control for here is whether performing the task is going to include areas that may show up in like fMRI, EEG, or whatever, but which are not necessarily correlated with the conscious experience of the person. And they're trying to get at that by asking them something specifically about whether the identity of the letter is, like in this case, whether it was R or not, what letter was there. So that's going to be all the task relevant activity. And then they ask them something that they were not told to keep track of. They weren't told to keep track of the color diversity, whether there's a lot of different colors or roughly, just a few of the colors. And what we're going to find out is that subjects can do it. They're pretty good at saying yes or no to the question, was there color diversity? Even though that wasn't part of the task. Okay, so that's the punchline.
In the case of the color diversity, it was an add-on. The first experiment didn't even involve color diversity. So the subjects had every reason to believe that the letter task was the main task, except in one version where they reversed these things. So they were not given feedback for the diversity task. Anyway, here is the amazing result. So this is, the blue is the congruent rows and the red is the incongruent rows. This is the queued row, this is the non-queued row. So
hold on, so blue is congruent and red is incongruent. So when it's congruent, that means the queued row is the one they ask you about the color diversity, I'm pretty sure. So if they queue it and they ask you about the queued row, that's congruent. If they queue it, that row, and then ask about a different row, that's the incongruent case. Okay, so what's the data here is that they're almost as good at diversity in unqueued rows as queued rows. So here's a row that was queued, and they ask them about whether there's high or low color diversity. Here's the unqueued row, so it's outside of where you're expecting their attention to be. And they're roughly around, 78? Yeah, so they're roughly as good.
Result is this, is that the subjects were almost as good as estimating the color diversity in the non-queued rows as in the queued rows. So this is queued row, non-queued row, queued row, non-queued row. The difference is not great between their ability to name to say the color diversity, to make the color diversity judgment in the cued, in the non-cued row as in the cued row. Further, their ability to do this was for free.
So working memory for cued letters is the same whether color diversity is about cued or uncued row. So that's why they could do it for free. What he's saying is that it's not as though it's not about asking them that question makes it them worse at the working memory task. Is that what he's trying to say? Okay.
In the sense that it did not have any impact on their working memory for the letters. This is the number of letters they could remember when the color diversity was from the cued row, and this is the number of letters they could remember when the color diversity was for the non-cued row. So color diversity, like the typical ensemble judgments, of which this may or may not be one, seems to come for free, and that is actually the idea of the experiment. The idea of the experiment was that there are certain kinds of judgments that seem to not impact the global workspace capacity. So they tried to use such a judgment to see what subjects' awareness was of the thing.
So, but doesn't this suggest that there is conceptualization outside of working memory? Or he's trying to say that this is like a perceptual thing, that there's no concepts there. I mean, it's going to be the question that keeps popping up is like, how do we know? Well, I guess he's got some arguments coming later about images and fatigue and stuff. Okay, let's get to it.
Of what is outside the focus of attention. Now, there are many different possible explanations, and one of them is that maybe on some subjects, some trial subjects ignored letters, and other times they ignored colors, but there was no negative correlation between those two. Another was maybe color diversity was done via unconscious perception, and they did two different manipulations to make sure that that was not the case. One is they had an escape button that the subjects were supposed to use if they didn't see the colors. And they didn't see the colors in the uncued row. They reliably used that escape button when the uncued row was colorless, but they didn't use it at all for the colored ones. And a second manipulation is they did another experiment where this was the original experiment, where this thing was presented for 300 milliseconds. In the new experiment, they presented it very briefly and presented these masks, which make the array harder to see. Notice this is low.
So this says 300 milliseconds, almost half a second. This is 16.7 milliseconds. And then you have a blank interval of 67 milliseconds followed by these masks. Okay.
Long versus short, the masks. And then they asked for judgments of awareness, how visible the array was. And what they found was that subjects' accuracy in estimating the diversity in the uncued rows was directly proportional to the visibility. This is the highest visibility rating. They were 80% accurate. Lowest visibility rating, they were at chance. So however.
Hold on here. So their visibility ratings, right? How visible were the things? Okay, and he says that this is correlating with how good they are at color diversity. So the higher the visibility, the higher the color diversity accuracy.
Averaging judgments could be done unconsciously. So there's a big difference between the diversity judgments.
Sorry about that.
and the average, they also got averaging judgments. What's the average color? The diversity is how diverse the colors are. So, and then another thing they did was a simulation that looked at diversity judgments versus averaging judgments as a function of noise. And what they found was that that the stability, this is the noise parameter, this is accuracy, this is the average judgments, and this is this is color diversity judgments, and this is single item judgments. So in their simulation, the diversity patterns with the single item, whereas the averaging is much more resistant to noise.
Okay, hold on. So the red line is the average up here. The blue line is a single item. And this one is the color diversity, the purple line down here. So this is their accuracy from 0 to 100%. These are the noise parameters. So as you make the signal more noisy, color average stays above about 90%. As you make the signal more noisy, the single item color detection drops to like 0, and so does color diversity. So here they're sort of suggesting that color diversity, the simulation, right, running this simulation, not with people, obviously, with a computer, but in the simulation, visibility sort of tracks. The more visible it is, the less noise, the more accurate you are. The less visible it is, the less accurate you are. I guess there is a bit of a worry about the conflation of the word visible with unconscious, or conscious, or invisible with unconscious. Because if what you're saying is that, all right, the noisiness is making the thing not seeable, is that the same as having an unconscious representation where you have a good representation of the thing, but that which isn't conscious? It's not degraded? I mean, that's the problem with a lot of this research, is that the way you study the unconscious by degrading the stimuli in such a way that the signals can't be matched. So it's not clear what to infer from it. But interesting, though. Okay. So there's got to be something here about what the frontal cortex or global workspace is doing to make all this relevant, right?
The upshot is subjects probably consciously saw a number of individual colors in the unconscious row, and that was over and above the letters that were
the uncued row, not the unconscious row.
In the global workspace. Suggests that the conclusion is that the conscious perception is probably richer than cognition.
Wait. So they probably saw a bunch of colors there. Okay. Yeah, I could buy that. Why does this show that conscious perception is probably richer than cognition? I don't understand this argument.
Individual colors in the unconscious row, and that was over and above the letters that were in the global workspace. Suggests that the conclusion is that the
because it's over and above the letters in the global workspace. So the real hidden premise here, or whatever, is that the letter, the thing you're reporting, is in the global workspace, but this other stuff is not in the global workspace. But how are you reporting? I don't get this. It seems to me not a bad argument. Gotta read the book.
This perception is probably richer than cognition. So now, if Sid Quader was here, he would no doubt say, and he's in Abu Dhabi, can't be here till later, he would probably say, well, maybe the precision was impacted. And actually, there are a number of independent experiments that strongly suggest, including one that just came out in 2014. The lead author is Asplund. Anybody wants, and these are going to be discussed in a later talk in the third talk. But the strong upshot is that there's lower accuracy when attention is deprived, but not lower precision. So what's the methodological improvement here is that some kinds of judgments, they may fit in the category of ensemble judgments, seem to get into the global workspace independently of the specific details, and those can cast light suggesting on this dispute.
So he agrees that these things are in the global workspace.
That this is the right idea and this is the wrong idea, that perception is rich and cognition is sparse because the attentional bottleneck is there.
I mean, this is the beginning of the talk, and already there's so much confusion. Oh, man. So, this question about perception is just assuming that perception is conscious. So you could agree that, I agree that perception is rich, but that doesn't mean that it's always conscious, or you experience all the richness of it. So how does this show independence? Okay, right? That shows that you could agree with that. So you experience the ensemble, whatever the ensemble judgment thing is. How does that show? Yeah, I don't know. I'm going to have to rethink. I'm going to have to think about this one carefully.
Okay, let me move now to a different paradigm with the same upshot. Another 2014 paper from Wolfgang Einhauser's lab. Now here's where you get to use your glasses. Anybody want to say what you see with both eyes?
We don't. We don't get the glasses.
Okay. Okay, if you keep looking, you should see face, house, face, house.
Yeah.
Yeah. It doesn't matter. Okay.
Ned is the king of these demos. He loves it. They're fun, actually, and I do think that it's important to demo this stuff because people don't really get it until they see it. But when you put the glasses on, what you see is you see the face, and then you see a house, and they kind of flip back and forth in a seeming random fashion.
How many are seeing the alternation of face, house, face, house? Oh, good. I'm glad to. So you can keep these on for a long time, and that alternation will keep going. Okay, so it's called Binocular Rivalry, and this has been a very important tool. So you can identify different areas of the brain depending on what the percept is. Now here is a group of studies.
So over here is the fusiform face area. This area is preferentially activated when you see a face. Over here is the perihippocampal place area in red, preferentially activated when you see a place, not a location, as opposed to a face. So that's nice. Now, given that these two things are switching back and forth in your conscious experience, you can have people press a button, press this button when it triggers the face, press this button when you see the house, and then you can kind of see what's going on in the brain as their conscious experience flips back and forth.
Depending on what the percept is. Now here is a group of studies that have looked at the brain bases of binocular rivalry. And what you see is, these are just the frontal and parietal lobes. There's also brain bases back here in the occipital and temporal lobes. But one of the things that's been a constant in this literature is strong activations in frontal areas, and that has been taken to support the global workspace view. However, these experiments did not, most of them were ones where subjects were reporting their experience. Some of the ones did not use reports, but they didn't have any index of the percept. Okay, the Einhauser, the achievement of the Einhauser lab was to use an index of perception that did not, the conscious perception that did not involve report. And this is, I think, an illustration of how sometimes the best discoveries come from low-tech ideas. So their idea was to use a phenomenon known as nystagmus. And if I can get this thing. So you're seeing nystagmus here. There's a drift of the eye. So these are gratings moving left. Or one eye is seeing gratings moving left. The other side is seeing gratings moving right. And you can tell what the percept is by which way the eyes are going. Okay? And this correlates not perfectly with report, about 83% accurate, 83% agreement with report, but in some ways it's better than report. At least it's better at indicating the neural networks that are moving, and that's
Notice he said 83% correlated with report. So 17% of the time, it's not correlated with report. So I mean, that's not nothing. Okay, so it's pretty accurate. But this whole argument he's about to go on here assumes that you can't have this when it's happening unconsciously. Now, I'm against the global workspace theory. So sometimes these ideas get conflated because I'm kind of friendly with a separate view, which also postulates that the higher order thought theory, which also postulates that possibly the prefrontal cortex is important for conscious experience. And there are different ways of cashing that out. So global workspace theory says prefrontal cortex is important. Higher order theories possibly also say prefrontal cortex is important. So they're both going to kind of agree that we should see something important in the prefrontal cortex, but they're going to say different things about what we should expect to see there. So I think this argument, even if it works against global workspace theory, doesn't really work against prefrontal theories generally, for the reasons we'll talk about when he actually makes the argument.
because it's a continuous measure, whereas the reports in this experiment and others tend to be binary. Anyway, here is the upshot. This is their conclusion. I'm quoting from what they say. Importantly, when observers passively, that is, didn't give a report, passively experience rivalry without reporting perceptual alternations, a different picture, that is a different picture from the frontal lobe global workspace view, emerged. Differential neural activity in frontal areas was absent, whereas activation in occipital and parietal regions persisted. We conclude that frontal areas are associated with active report and introspection. The idea is...
Now, hold on now. So notice it says differential neural activity. So that's what the global workspace theories all really got worked up about, is that when you present something subliminally or masked or whatever, you see the visual areas respond to the stimulus, but you don't see a kind of ignition of activity from there to the frontal areas. But when the person reports, I see it, then you see not only the areas in the back of the head, the visual areas, but also there's this ignition forward into the frontal areas, a lot of activity up there. And so that was their idea. It's almost like all this information is being sent into this global workspace. And there's this ignition, a lot of activity up there, which is absent in the case where you don't consciously see the thing. So the evidence here is allegedly showing that, well, that was because the person had to report the thing. And if you take that away, then the neural activity in the prefrontal cortex is the same in the two cases, statistically. Now notice, you could accept that might be a problem for global workspace theory, which says you should have this ignition. But if you just think the prefrontal cortex is involved, then that's perfectly okay to say, yeah, well, let's check and see, can you decode the content? Can you decode whether the percept is the face or the house by looking at the prefrontal areas? And that, of course, is the question I'm interested in, and it's not addressed by this. But so, while I think that this could be an argument against global workspace theories, that the conscious experience of the difference involves this massive ignition of activity in the prefrontal cortex, I don't think that's generally an argument against prefrontal theories. Anyway, okay.
Their experiment shows, and I've given you just part of it, is that that in this experiment, at least, what the reason for the global workspace activation is that subjects are monitoring, in order to report, they are monitoring their experience. It's that monitoring and then organizing a response that is responsible for the global workspace activation. So the methodological improvement here is just don't ask for reports at all, okay? If the problem is disentangling the conscious experience from the reports, and if you don't even ask for reports, you're doing a lot better in disentangling them.
Yeah, so then look, the problem though is that when you are showing like these stimuli in a way that the subject says they don't see them, but you still notice the eye movements, and then you infer, oh, well, because in the conscious case that was there, and it's here in the case where the subject says they don't see it, this must be a case where it's conscious, but the subject just says they don't see it. That's the problem. And I don't think this really establishes an 80% track record. It's not good enough. in my opinion.
Another experiment, which I'm only going to mention briefly and not go into any details, I think it's not quite as indicative as the others, but it's worth something. This is an experiment by Michael Pitts, in which, I don't know if you can see this, but okay, there are these circles with dots, and in the background there are oriented lines. Can you see the oriented lines? No. Okay, so the oriented lines can form figures, and it's really, I can't even see them very well from here. But, you know, I'm sorry that, well, anyway, there it is. So here's what he did. I'll just give you, describe part of the experiment. Part of the experiment is he showed, the subject's task was to report a slight increase in size in one of those circles. Okay? And he made it very hard. The circles the difference in size was very small, and so you had to really focus on this periphery. At the same time, there was a constantly changing background. And on many of the trials, there were certain figures, for example, a square in the background. But the subjects had 240 trials before they were asked anything about the background. They weren't told that anything about the background being significant. And the finding is, this was an ERP finding, so it was precisely looking at the timing. The finding is, then after 240 trials, he gave them questionnaires.
ERP is event-related potential, which means you present it over and over and over again, record the same stimulus from the same area, from the same people, then you average them together and you get this like evoked response specifically to the stimulus.
And then correlated the results of the questionnaires with their ERP from the previous experiment. What he found was that what correlated best with the conscious experience of the squares was early ERP signals before global workspace activation. So again, it supports back of the head activation as the correlate. And again, the key methodological improvement here is don't ask for reports at the time of the percept. So the upshot is then, this is from Stan DeHaan's 2014 book. He says, when the prefrontal cortex does not gain access to a message, it cannot be broadly shared and therefore remains unconscious. But I think it's about conceptualized information. That is, what the prefrontal cortex, what is needed, the activation of the prefrontal cortex and what the global workspace is doing is it is registering conceptualized percepts, but that allows for unconceptualized percepts to be active, and they may be conscious percepts to be active even when they do not get into the global workspace.
So he hasn't said what he means by conscious. I guess I've been assuming he means phenomenal consciousness since he's fucking Ned Block over here. But there's no kind of argument that what's there is phenomenally conscious or conscious in any sense, except for that is tracking something in the environment, making us aware of it, but not consciously aware of it.
Just to summarize this part of the talk, there's evidence for rich conscious perception from...
It's rich perception. Is it conscious?
Gist or ensemble judgments, or maybe it's something different. The diversity may not be exactly the same as the other ones. Delayed answers and indicators of conscious state from eye movements. So these are all low-tech ideas that support the idea that non-conceptual conscious experience can exist even when there is no conceptualized experience in the global workspace. Now, let me move to an issue about...
All right, let's pause it here because I'm noticing it's getting on in time. I do have to go. This is getting interesting, but I really don't think he's established what he thinks he's established. I mean, I don't think these experiments really do the work that he wants them to do. But I'm going to have to go back and reread those papers and see what I'm missing there. But cool. Wow, this is good stuff. How far are we even into this video? We're 36 minutes, and so we still have 5 hours to go. We'll make it eventually, guys.